Time: 4:47 a.m., June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. The landing craft bucked violently in the gray-green water. Second Lieutenant Robert Dietrich pressed his binoculars against his eyes from the German bunker overlooking the beach, and what he saw made no tactical sense. The American assault should have been a textbook disaster. His machine gun crews had clear fields of fire across 300 yards of open sand. His mortar teams had the range dialed in perfectly. The American soldiers climbing out of those transport ships were exposed, encumbered, and exactly where his fire plan said they would be. By 4:53 a.m., 6 minutes into the assault, the outcome should have been decided, but it wasn't. Instead of coherent waves of soldiers advancing under clear command authority, Dietrich watched something fragmented and chaotic unfold before him. A sergeant nobody was shouting at suddenly gestured 3 riflemen left toward a drainage ditch. A private he'd never seen before rallied a group of pinned-down men around an abandoned Sherman tank, and they began suppressive fire on the bunker to his right. Officers were falling. Dietrich watched Lieutenant John Spaulding take shrapnel and go down. Yet instead of the American advance collapsing, it accelerated. The dead officers' platoon split into 2 groups. One went left toward the seawall, the other flanked toward the bluff. Nobody was giving elaborate orders. Nobody was waiting for authorization. The soldiers seemed to be deciding what came next, and they were deciding it faster than Dietrich's men could kill them. By dawn on June 6th, Omaha Beach was supposed to be an American grave. Instead, it was the first clear signal of something that would puzzle German commanders for the rest of the war. The hook. German military doctrine had spent a century perfecting the art of flexible command, teaching soldiers to think, to adapt, to take initiative. Yet somehow, the Americans, who had no such doctrine, no such training philosophy, were doing it better, and the Germans couldn't figure out why. By the summer of 1944, German army officers had begun collecting a disturbing pattern. They were writing reports about American soldiers who fought without visible orders. They noted American squads that reorganized themselves after losing officers. They documented American privates who made tactical decisions that precisely matched, what their dead lieutenant would have wanted them to do. One memo, dated August 1944 and captured by British intelligence, described American soldiers as operating with a disturbing independence that suggests either chaos or a training system we do not fully understand. It wasn't chaos, but the Germans were indeed looking at something their training system had no vocabulary for. To understand this puzzle, we need to understand what the Germans thought they were facing versus what they were actually fighting. In 1806, Prussia faced a disaster. The Grande Armée under Napoleon destroyed the Prussian army at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt in a single catastrophic afternoon. 25,000 Prussian soldiers fell. The fortress of Magdeburg surrendered without firing a shot because its commander couldn't get authorization from a king who no longer effectively existed. The Prussian General Staff, the institution that would define military excellence for the next 150 years, sifted through the wreckage and asked a question that changed warfare forever. Why did we lose? The answer they arrived at was deceptively simple. We were trained to obey. The French were trained to think. Prussian officers had been drilled in a system where orders flowed down from the top like water through a pipe. You received an order. You carried it out exactly. You waited for the next order. When the situation on the ground changed faster than communication could account for, Prussian officers froze. They couldn't improvise. It wasn't in their training. French marshals and colonels, operating under Napoleon's system, didn't have that problem. When the situation changed, they acted. They made decisions. They adapted, and when they couldn't reach Napoleon to ask permission, they simply didn't ask. The Prussians decided to copy what had nearly destroyed them. A generation of reformers, Gerhard von Scharnhorst, Karl von Clausewitz, and later Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, tore the Prussian military system apart and rebuilt it around a radical principle. They called it Auftragstactik, mission-type tactics, or sometimes translated as intent-based command. Here's how it worked. A commanding officer wouldn't give you detailed instructions on how to accomplish something. Instead, he would tell you the objective. He would tell you why you were doing it, the strategic purpose, the larger picture. Then he would get out of your way and let you figure out how to make it happen. Helmuth von Moltke codified this into the system that would conquer most of Europe. He wrote instructions to his generals that read almost like a philosophy of freedom. The order should contain everything that is possible to decide beforehand, nothing more. The order must leave room for the subordinate to show his initiative and flexibility. There's a story every Prussian cadet learned that captured the entire philosophy. Prince Frederick Charles of Prussia was reviewing a general's conduct of a maneuver and found a tactical error. He demanded an explanation. The general replied that he was simply following orders. The prince responded with a line that defined Prussian military culture. Your Majesty made you a general because he believed you would know when not to obey his orders. Read that again. A superior officer telling a subordinate that disobeying orders could be the right thing to do. That was the heart of the doctrine. By 1933, this philosophy had been formally documented in a manual called Truppenführung, troop leadership, which German officers still studied and quoted. It said plainly, war is the realm of friction and uncertainty. The commander on the spot must be free to decide. Initiative wasn't just encouraged in the German military, it was considered a duty. Hesitation was treated as a greater sin than making a wrong decision boldly. When the Wehrmacht invaded Poland in September 1939, the system was tested at scale for the first time. American military attachés who studied the Polish campaign were stunned. They produced a report that noted the Germans had developed leadership and initiative in commanders at all echelons, and all commanders from the highest to the lowest felt free to carry out their missions and meet changes with a minimum of interference from above. The Americans circulated the report, read it, then filed it away. While Germany was building a system based on trust and initiative, the American military was building something almost opposite. The U.S. Army in the 1920s and 1930s was small, isolated, and profoundly hierarchical. Officers and enlisted men lived in separate worlds on military bases, literally different housing, different clubs, different social hierarchies. The officer corps, drawn heavily from the aristocratic academies and family military traditions, saw enlisted men as a separate class of people. They weren't educated to think strategically. They weren't expected to make decisions. They were expected to follow orders precisely. This wasn't unique to America. Most militaries operated this way. But it was the opposite of the German system. American doctrine in the 1930s emphasized detailed orders, clear chains of command, and strict adherence to procedure. A soldier was praised for carrying out orders exactly. Initiative was not forbidden, but it wasn't especially encouraged. The military manuals of the era emphasized obedience and discipline above all else. There was also a curious disconnect in how American military culture viewed NCOs, non-commissioned officers like sergeants. Unlike in the German system, where sergeants were expected to be strategic thinkers and leaders, the American sergeant was often viewed as a technical specialist or enforcer. Good sergeants were valuable, but they were largely expected to supervise enlisted men's execution of officers' orders, not to make independent tactical decisions. Then, World War II happened. And suddenly, the entire structure of American military organization had to change overnight. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Army had about 1.6 million soldiers. By 1943, it had 7 million. You cannot expand a military by 400% and maintain rigid hierarchy. There simply aren't enough experienced officers. What happened instead was necessity forced a revolution in how Americans organized combat units. By 1943, new divisions were being thrown into combat with officers who had months, sometimes weeks, of command experience. Sergeants who might have been factory workers or farmers a year earlier suddenly found themselves leading squads of 10 to 12 men in combat zones. Platoon leaders were sometimes just high school graduates with OCS, Officer Candidate School, training. First sergeants ran companies because there weren't enough captains to go around. The system had no choice but to function differently. A 1943 training memo from the Army's Replacement and Training Command noted, "Officers will not always be present to give orders. Each man must know his job and be prepared to act without specific orders when the situation demands it." It was a doctrine born of desperation, not philosophy, but desperation often produces the best innovations. American division commanders noticed something in 1943 and early 1944. Soldiers who had trained together, who understood the mission, who trusted their sergeants and knew their sergeants trusted them back, performed better in combat. They didn't need to wait for orders. They could anticipate what was needed and do it. But this was happening almost accidentally. There was no official doctrine for it. There was no German-style philosophical framework. American officers weren't sitting in classrooms learning about mission command. They were figuring it out in the field because it worked. When American forces landed in North Africa in November 1942, German observers noted something unusual. American soldiers seemed less rigidly organized than expected. But the Americans had also performed poorly at Kasserine Pass, suggesting that their flexibility came with a cost. The Americans seemed less individually skilled as soldiers than German regulars. The assessment was partly correct. German soldiers, especially the professionals who had been in uniform since the 1930s, were often individually more skilled fighters than American draftees. They had more training, they had more experience, they could shoot better, march farther, and understood small unit tactics more intimately. But by 1944, something had shifted. American soldiers had combat experience now, and their organizational system, born of necessity rather than doctrine, was starting to show its advantages. In June 1944, on the beaches of Normandy, German commanders began seeing the real problem with their perfect system. The Wehrmacht's doctrine required one thing above all: trust between levels of command. The general had to trust the colonel to make the right decision. The colonel had to trust the major had to trust the captain, and so on down. But the Nazi political system had systematically destroyed that trust. The Hitler regime had imposed political officers, commissars, on military units. Officers who reported to the Nazi party, not to the army chain of command. Officers who could countermand military decisions for political reasons. Generals who were afraid to make independent decisions because they could be accused of disloyalty to the regime. The doctrine of Auftragstaktik required something the Nazis couldn't permit: autonomous military thinking that might diverge from political control. Meanwhile, the American system, crude, unphilosophical, built on necessity, didn't require that kind of trust between levels. It required something different. It required trust within the squad, a sergeant and his men, an officer and his platoon, people who had trained together, who knew each other, who understood what needed to happen because they'd discussed the mission in detail before it started. American organizational culture also made this possible in ways that had nothing to do with the military. Here's something almost no one discusses when analyzing American military effectiveness in World War II. American soldiers came from a country where they'd already learned to make independent decisions before they ever put on a uniform. An American farm boy in 1940 knew how to fix his tractor. He didn't wait for the government to send someone to fix it for him. He figured it out. A factory worker knew how to troubleshoot why a machine had stopped working. He didn't wait for an official manual. He tried things until it worked. Americans had been raised in a culture where initiative was normal, where the person on the spot was expected to solve the problem rather than escalate it up a hierarchy. German soldiers came from a culture with a different history. Their society had a deep respect for hierarchy, for authority, for official channels. Initiative was good, but it operated within that hierarchy, under officers who had been trained in a specific philosophy. American sergeants, by contrast, had often grown up in a culture where the idea of the person on the spot makes the decision was simply common sense. A shopkeeper didn't wait for corporate headquarters to decide whether to help a customer. He helped them. A laborer didn't wait for the boss to tell him how to finish a job. He figured out how, and did it. When those sergeants put on uniforms and suddenly had authority over men, they often managed their squads the way they'd been managed in civilian life, with clear objectives and the understanding that the men under them could be trusted to figure out the details. And when American officers, many of them suddenly promoted from enlisted ranks, led platoons, they often replicated that pattern. Tell the men what you need done, why you need it done, then trust them to do it. It was almost an accidental recreation of German mission-type tactics, but it came from American civilian culture rather than military doctrine. June 6, 1944 shattered German expectations of what American soldiers could do. Lieutenant John Spaulding was the commander of the first wave of Easy Company, 506th Regiment, 101st Airborne. He was 28 years old, from Delaware, and he'd been in command of his platoon for about 4 weeks. His men had trained together for only slightly longer. By every measure of military readiness that the German High Command understood, they were inadequate. When the landing craft hit the beach at Omaha, Spaulding's men immediately faced a shattered command structure. The beach was chaos. Officers were being shot down. Radio communications failed. Waves of soldiers were being pinned down by well-positioned German machine gunners who had clear fields of fire across the beach. Here's where the system showed itself. Lieutenant Spaulding, despite taking shrapnel, made a decision that no one had specifically ordered him to make. He decided that sitting pinned on the beach was death. The only way out was through the German defenses. He gathered what men he could, not a neat platoon, but whoever was near him, and started moving toward the seawall. One of his sergeants, Sergeant Mac Mackamer, noticed that Spaulding was hit and bleeding. Instead of waiting for Spaulding to continue leading from a prone position, Mackamer immediately began organizing the men around him, not men from Spaulding's platoon necessarily, but whatever soldiers had drifted to their position, and started moving them toward the bluff. A private named Warren Babe Huff found himself with a group of men from 3 different units, led by an officer he didn't recognize. No one had told him what to do, no one had given him orders, but he understood what was needed. The German positions above the beach had to be suppressed while the soldiers regrouped. He grabbed a Browning automatic rifle and began laying down fire on the bluff, timing his shots to cover movement. What was happening was dozens of small decisions made by different men that somehow coordinated with each other. Not through shouted orders or radio communications, but through each man understanding the larger objective. Get off the beach, get up the bluff, break through the German positions. German observers watching from the bunkers couldn't explain it. Captain Ernst Bayer, commanding a strong point above Omaha Beach, later reported in an interrogation. The American soldiers appeared to be operating with a unity of purpose without a visible command hierarchy. Even when officers fell, the men continued to advance as if they understood the plan without being told. The thing that genuinely confused him was this: they did understand the plan. American officers had spent the weeks before the invasion briefing their men extensively. Soldiers knew the objectives. They knew why those objectives mattered. They knew what terrain they were likely to encounter and where they were supposed to go. It wasn't mind reading. It was preparation meeting initiative. As the war progressed through 1944, German commanders started to articulate what was happening, but they framed it as a problem with their own system rather than as anything the Americans had deliberately created. General Ludwig Cruel, captured in North Africa, told his British interrogators in a remarkable conversation recorded in July 1944. The Germans have built an army of great complexity, where each man is trained to think within his own sphere, but this requires constant communication between spheres. When communication fails, when the order-giving apparatus breaks down, the German soldier is paralyzed. The American soldier, when deprived of orders, simply continues the mission as best he understands it. He was right. The German system had a critical vulnerability. It worked brilliantly, as long as communications functioned, as long as officers could reach their men with updated orders and direction. If the communication network was disrupted, by artillery, by the chaos of battle, by losses of officers, German units became sluggish. They waited for new direction because that's what their training taught them to do. American units, by contrast, didn't have that elaborate communication network to depend on. They operated with simpler systems and lower expectations of getting frequent updates. When communication failed, they didn't freeze. They improvised. The moment when German officers reached their limit of understanding came during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, what Americans call the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans had planned a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, hoping to split the American and British armies and force a negotiated peace. It was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice by a military that was losing the war of attrition. For the first days, the Germans had success. American units were scattered, surprised, and pushed back. But as the battle developed, something unexpected happened. American soldiers and NCOs, many of them in chaotic mixed units without their parent regiments, began making tactical decisions independently. A sergeant from the 101st Airborne Division named Donald Burgett found himself separated from his company. Instead of trying to find his own unit and wait for orders, he gathered whatever men were near him and established a defensive position that complemented the larger tactical picture. He didn't have radio communication with battalion. He didn't have explicit orders to do this, but he understood what the situation required. This happened hundreds of times during the Bulge. A captain captured by the Germans during interrogation in January 1945 described American tactics. The American squad leader does not wait for explicit instruction. He observes the tactical situation and acts to address it. If his officer falls, he continues the mission. This appears to be standard training, not individual initiative. It wasn't standard training. There was no official doctrine for it, but it was the inevitable product of how American units had learned to operate through 1943 and 1944. German officers began asking a question that appeared in prisoner interrogation reports, written testimonies, and later in memoirs. How are the Americans able to make these tactical decisions so quickly? How are these men trained to understand what to do without being told? The answer, had the Germans been able to fully articulate it, was something called leadership by comprehension, or leadership by understanding. An American officer, when planning an operation, would spend time explaining not just what needed to happen, but why it needed to happen. A platoon sergeant might say something like, "We're taking the ridge because from there we can observe the valley and prevent German armor from using that road to reinforce the town. Once we take the ridge, we hold it because if we don't, the division's flank is exposed and they can push down the road and cut off the regiment." A young soldier hearing that explanation didn't just know what to do, he understood what the action meant. If his sergeant was killed taking the ridge, the young soldier understood why he needed to finish the assault, not because he'd been ordered to keep assaulting, but because he understood that failure meant encirclement. If that young soldier's sergeant had planned to approach the ridge from the north but discovered German reinforcements blocking that route, he wouldn't panic. He understood that the actual goal was to take the ridge and control that valley. He could figure out a new route because he understood the objective, not just the original plan. This was almost mission-type tactics, but it emerged from a different source. It emerged from American confidence that soldiers could be trusted with information, and from the necessity of combat where officers were constantly being killed or moved to other assignments. German doctrine assumed that soldiers could be trusted with freedom, the freedom to take initiative when the situation changed, but it assumed that an officer would be there to direct that freedom toward the correct objective. American practice had developed something different. Soldiers who were trusted with understanding, not just freedom. Soldiers who understood the purpose of their mission completely enough that they could improvise within it. Let's look at what an actual American infantry squad looked like in combat by 1944 and how it functioned without explicit orders. A standard American rifle squad in 1944 had about 12 men. 1 sergeant, squad leader, 1 corporal, assistant squad leader, often second squad, 2 bar men, Browning automatic rifles, and 2 assistants, 7 riflemen. In theory, this was a rigid structure. In practice, it was remarkably flexible. The squad sergeant, usually someone who'd been in the Army for at least 2 years by 1944, had enormous practical authority. He decided how the squad moved. He decided what positions they took. He decided how ammunition was distributed. He could, within the bounds of his lieutenant's general orders, make independent decisions about how to accomplish what he'd been told to accomplish. The machine gunners, bar teams, were key. A bar could put down suppressive fire that shaped the entire squad's movement. The bar teams understood their role so intimately that they could anticipate what suppressive fire would be needed without being told. When we move right, I'm covering the tree line. Nobody had to say it. When a squad moved to assault a position, the movement itself communicated what was happening. The barmen would move to positions where they could lay down fire. The riflemen would move in the spaces where that fire had suppressed enemy response. The sergeant would position himself where he could see most of the action and make adjustments if something went wrong. A German NCO watching this would see what looked like chaos, men moving without shouted orders, making sudden changes in direction, adapting to what the enemy was doing, and couldn't understand how they stayed coordinated. But they stayed coordinated because each man understood what the others were trying to accomplish. There's a famous account from the Ardennes campaign from an American sergeant named Curtis Anderson. His squad was defending a small village when a German counterattack came in at dawn. The squad was scattered. Half the men were in the church, half were in a rubble pile across the main street. When Anderson's lieutenant, his only officer, was killed by an artillery burst, the squad could have broken. Instead, Anderson's radio man, a 19-year-old private from Ohio, immediately started shouting to coordinate the two groups. Not to surrender, not to retreat. He was directing fire from the rubble pile to support the men in the church. The barman in the rubble repositioned without being told to cover the church's left flank. Within 3 minutes, without Anderson even explicitly ordering anything, the squad had reorganized itself into a defensive position that was actually better than their original formation, more spread out, less vulnerable to the artillery that had killed the lieutenant. The German squad attacking from across the street couldn't sustain the assault. It failed. The German squad sergeant reported afterward that he couldn't understand how Americans who'd lost their officer had managed to improve their defensive position instead of collapsing. The answer was simple. Every man in that American squad understood that the mission was to hold that position. Every man understood approximately where the others should be, and every man had been trained, through months of movement, experience, and trust, to make small decisions about how to accomplish what needed to be accomplished. German military analysts of 1945 produced several explanations for what they were seeing. Some blamed American training. They suggested American soldiers must be receiving specialized instruction in independent action. This was partly true. Some American units trained specifically for independent action, but most didn't. Most American soldiers learned to take initiative through a combination of necessity and leadership example. Some blamed superior American numbers and logistics. This was true, but irrelevant to the question of how American squads made decisions. Having more ammunition didn't explain how they made better tactical decisions without orders. Some blamed American indiscipline. They suggested that what looked like tactical flexibility was actually just chaos that worked because of American luck. This was understandable from their perspective. They were trained to see detailed order following as discipline, so anything else looked chaotic. But it wasn't chaotic. It was disciplined in a different way. A few German officers understood the deeper truth. General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, who commanded forces against the Americans in 1945, wrote after the war, "The Americans possessed something more valuable than individual tactical skill, a military culture in which the man at the lowest level was trusted to think about the mission, not just execute it." He was right, and it was something Germany couldn't recreate because it required trust that the Nazi regime had systematically destroyed. By any pure metric of military skill, marksmanship, physical fitness, tactical knowledge, the German soldier in 1944 was often superior to the American soldier. Casualty ratios in many engagements favored the Germans. Individual German units often inflicted more casualties than they sustained, but by 1945, the German army was being defeated, not because individual Germans were poor soldiers, but because the system was failing. The Wehrmacht suffered particularly in the final phase of the European War from a catastrophic problem. As losses mounted, the carefully structured chain of command that mission-type tactics depended on was being shattered. Young German soldiers, 16, 17, 18 years old with weeks of training, were being thrown into combat under NCOs who often weren't professional soldiers, but older enlisted men with little leadership experience. They were trying to apply a system that required sophisticated training and trust within a structure that was collapsing. American soldiers, meanwhile, were operating a system that didn't require the same level of perfect communication and hierarchy. They needed good sergeants, good junior officers, and soldiers who understood their mission. They could function, indeed, they often functioned better, when that hierarchy was disrupted. The cost was staggering on both sides. From June 1944 through May 1945, the European theater saw nearly 600,000 American casualties. German casualties were similar, or higher. The total military and civilian death toll from the European war exceeded 40 million. But in the final reckoning, the American system proved more robust. Units that lost officers could continue. Squads that were separated from their regiments could function. Soldiers with limited training could still perform effectively because they understood the objective. Here's the remarkable historical irony. The Germans had invented the philosophical framework for independent soldier action that gave American units their advantage. If any military in World War II should have been able to replicate American tactics, it should have been the Wehrmacht. But by 1944-1945, they couldn't. The Nazi regime had systematically undermined the preconditions for mission-type tactics to function. The insertion of Nazi party officers into military units had created an atmosphere of suspicion. Generals and colonels couldn't trust their captains completely. Captains couldn't trust their sergeants completely. How could you apply a doctrine of trust and initiative when there were party officials watching to ensure political loyalty? More fundamentally, German military culture had become dependent on the military hierarchy in a way that American culture never was. An American farmer knew how to solve problems without waiting for authority. An American worker knew how to improvise. An American shopkeeper knew how to make decisions on the spot. A German farm boy had been trained by school, family, and society to respect authority, to follow instructions, to not act without permission. The German military system tried to give him permission to act, through mission-type tactics, but only within certain bounds, and only if the chain of trust held. By 1945, that chain was shattered. After the war, military theorists around the world studied how the American army had beaten the German army. What they found was both obvious and mysterious. The Americans had won because they had better logistics, more resources, and eventually overwhelming numbers. That was true. But they had also won because of something less tangible. Their soldiers were able to fight better when communications broke down, when command structures were disrupted, when the plan changed. American soldiers adapted. American squads reorganized themselves. American platoons continued the mission even without officers. NATO militaries, now aligned with America, studied how to replicate this. The German military, reconstructed as West Germany, went back to its own traditions of mission-type tactics, but with important modifications. By the 1970s, military theorists were explicitly studying mission command, the idea that commanders should focus on intent and purpose, not detailed procedures. The U.S. Marine Corps, studying their own performance in World War II and Korea, developed a doctrine of leadership that emphasized trust and understanding. By the 1980s, military academies around the world were teaching the principle that a soldier needs to understand why he's doing something, not just what to do. This became standard doctrine in American, British, German, and other NATO militaries. The irony is complete. The Germans had invented mission-type tactics in 1812 as a response to Napoleon. The Americans, by accident and necessity, had reinvented it through 1943-1944. After the war, professional militaries around the world took both lessons, the German philosophical framework and the American practical example, and created modern military doctrine. By 1945, most of the soldiers who had figured out how to fight without explicit orders were just trying to stay alive. Many of them didn't know they'd been part of something historically significant. They were just trying to accomplish their mission and make sure the men next to them got home. Sergeant Curtis Anderson of the Village Defense survived the war, went home to his small town in the Midwest, and worked in a feed store for 40 years. He rarely talked about the war. Private Warren Huff, who had understood his role on Omaha Beach without explicit instruction, came home and worked as a mechanic. He died in 1998. Platoon Sergeant Donald Burgett, who had gathered mixed units in the Ardennes without orders, wrote a memoir about his experience that became required reading at several military academies. He lived until 2011. Most of the officers and NCOs who had pioneered this system of trust and understanding never knew they were inventing anything. They were just trying to win, trying to keep their men alive, trying to accomplish their mission. Some of them went on to have distinguished military careers. Some went back to civilian life and were almost forgotten by history. But what they demonstrated, that soldiers could be trusted with understanding, not just compliance, changed how militaries thought about leadership for the rest of the century. The question that German Captain Hullman, or officers like him, asked in the Ardennes, "Who is commanding these men?" was asked from genuine confusion. The answer was, everyone and no one. The men were commanding themselves because they understood the mission. They understood what their dead officer would have wanted them to do. They understood what the larger battle required, and they had been trained, through months of combat and leadership, to trust each other enough to act without explicit direction. This was not a revolutionary discovery about American soldiers' innate superiority. Individual Germans were probably more skillfully trained. German officers were probably more sophisticated in their military thinking. But the American system, one built on the assumption that soldiers could be trusted with understanding, combined with a culture that expected people to solve problems and make decisions, proved more effective in the chaos of modern industrial warfare. The Germans had written the manual on how to do this. The Americans had never read the manual. Instead, through accident, necessity, and cultural instinct, they had implemented it better. In the end, the answer to why Germans couldn't explain how American squads fought without orders is this: they were watching something that grew from the intersection of several forces that the Germans understood individually but couldn't see as a unified system. American soldiers who came from a culture where taking initiative was normal. American sergeants who led by explanation and trust rather than hierarchy and authority. American officers who had been promoted from the ranks and trusted the men under them. American military necessity that didn't allow for the elaborate communication networks that rigid hierarchies depend on. And underneath it all, one more factor. Americans who had never been trained that they needed permission to think. The Germans had built a military system that allowed soldiers to think. The Americans had built something different. They had built a military system that expected soldiers to think because the alternative, waiting for permission in a chaos, meant death. What the Germans were watching across those snowy fields and hedgerows of 1944-1945 wasn't a new system. It was the unexpected collision of a military system born of necessity and a culture that had never taught its people that they needed to wait. That combination, accident meeting culture meeting necessity, was something the Wehrmacht, for all its sophistication, couldn't replicate. The men who figured this out rarely spoke about it afterward. They had bigger concerns: getting home, getting over what they'd seen, trying to live normal lives. But what they had demonstrated, in places like Omaha Beach and the Ardennes and hundreds of other battlefields, was a principle that would reshape military thinking for generations. Trust your soldiers with understanding, not just orders. Expect them to think, not just obey. Create leaders at every level who understand the mission deeply enough to lead when higher command can't be reached. It seemed revolutionary when viewed through a German lens. In the American context, it seemed almost obvious, and that difference, between what seemed revolutionary and what seemed obvious, explained everything about why German officers couldn't explain what they were seeing. They were watching a culture at war, not an army at war. And you can't understand a culture by studying its tactics. You have to understand its history, its assumptions about how people should behave, its fundamental beliefs about authority and trust. The German soldiers who survived 1944 and 1945 came home to a country that had been destroyed. Many of them spent decades trying to understand why they had lost. Some eventually understood that they hadn't lost because they were less brave, less intelligent, or less skilled than their enemies. They'd lost because their system, for all its brilliance, depended on something that their politics had destroyed. The American soldiers who survived came home to a country that had won. Most of them never thought about what they'd done differently. They just went back to being farmers and mechanics and shopkeepers, back to trusting the man next to them, back to solving problems on their own. Neither group fully understood what they were part of, but in the historical record, in the interrogations and memoirs and military analyses, the question remains: how did American squads fight without orders? The answer is that they were never really fighting without orders. They were fighting with the deepest kind of order there is: shared understanding of purpose. They were fighting with the kind of order that grows not from hierarchy but from culture, not from command, but from comprehension. And that kind of order, once it exists, is almost impossible for an outside observer to see. It looks like chaos until you realize that's not chaos. That's coordination at a level deeper than shouted commands. That's what the Germans couldn't explain. That's what the American soldiers barely understood they were doing. And that's the legacy that changed how militaries think about leadership for the rest of the 20th century.